इधर का हो गया काम? नहीं क्या हो रहा है? कल का साइड में क्या हो जाती है? मार दिया? हाँ। हाँ? मार दिया?
Good morning, friends, colleagues, dignitaries, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Deepak Nair, Professor Anil Sadgopal, Professor Mao, Professor Sharma, and other esteemed colleagues. Now we are going to start our first session. So before that, I would invite our dignitaries for the first session on the dais. Our chief guest, Vice Chancellor, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Sudhir Kumar Sapori, may kindly come here, sir. Professor Deepak Nair, the chairperson of the session, may kindly also come here. Professor Anil Sadgopal, our keynote speaker. He arrived yesterday early in the morning, and so he has been there very keenly waiting for this seminar. So I invite him here also on the dais, and Professor Arun Kumar. Honorable Chairperson, Professor Deepak Nair, Chairman of the session, Professor Sudhir Kumar Sapori, Vice Chancellor, our chief guest here, Professor Anil Sadgopal, our keynote speaker, and Professor Arun Kumar, President, Jawaharlal Nehru Teachers Association. Sir, we welcome you all here on the dais, and we have the great pleasure of having this seminar early this morning on a macro global picture or situation about the higher education. Friends, we thought of inviting you all the colleagues here in the university and other universities, and we are going to have lot of delegates from other universities. We have two representatives from the Northeast, Hill University, Shillong, and then Gwalior University, Hyderabad Central University, and maybe that we have people from Kanpur, from Rajasthan, and other places as well. Inside Delhi, we will have representatives from Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi University, Intrust University, Ambedkar University, Delhi. All the 5 major universities will be represented by their delegates, especially the Teachers Association, as well as independent scholars and teachers will be participating. So, on the behalf of university and particularly on behalf of the Jawaharlal Nehru Teachers Association, I welcome you all this early morning with the expectation that this will be really a very, very important discussion over here. Friends, just to allow you have some picture of what we thought, although we have already circulated and sent you the concept note for the seminar, again a little bit of a small introduction is necessary, that what we have exactly here. See, the situation is about macro picture, the global picture affecting higher education in India, and this is a period of globalization. And we have a large population, huge population, which is almost 4 times the population of France, which is illiterate. So with this, we find that our education traditionally has been functioning with so many roles. It's simple, 2 functions are major functions. One is socio-cultural reproduction and economic reproduction, and the second one is to provide a critique of the inherited traditions in order to have a futuristic vision for that. And with that, within you can see you have individual empowerment, scientific, technological, economic development, which and universities have been also site of citizenship and democratic culture. And there is no clear-cut boundary, but all these boundaries are overlapping and they cut across each other. It is really very difficult to separate them. The role of higher education has been specifically based on scientific innovations which have been there, rational reasoning, and it provides studies in many fields, not only social sciences, history or education, but any or all of the fields, disciplines we have. And the another responsibility is the inner practice of democratic culture. Within academia or scientific enterprise, we have this democracy without which we cannot really have. Now, the historical roots, long back Aristotle has thought that state's responsibility is one, and so the education should be also same for all, and it should not be the private affair. Now, based on this, we can see that now education has moved from being a public good to a private affair. Now, earlier education has been what it has done to the individual, and it has been always so, and it will remain like that. Education has been always providing economic wealth and culture and critical thinking. All this I have said. Actually, this is what I wanted to focus on, the macro or the global picture of education. Education scene and the entire world situation has changed, and this is what I mean that there is a new globalization which is taking place, and it is not simply a higher form of internationalization, it is more than that. Modern era is turbulent phenomena, which is exhibited by uncertainty, contingency, fluidity, and change. Common cause is a liquid modern because of this and instability that we live with. In the sense that there is nothing which is very fixed, and everything keeps on constantly changing. Our identities, our relationship to the world, these are all changing. Education is no more a public good, but a consumerist education, in the sense that consumer education denies the source of higher education. It doesn't really allow people to secure their own betterment in that sense of inner satisfaction. Rather, it allows people to free from agony of insecurity. They take refuge in the conducting education, security, status, ranking, and level. Actually, consumerist education or liquid education, whatever you can say, is self-serving and addictive. And what is its paradigm? The paradigm is to move away from the pursuit of truth and purpose to the pursuit of efficiency and survival. And probably this is what the theme of Professor Anish Sadgopal will be, how neoliberalism or globalization has been affecting our education system. 21st century, this is the modern, this particular century, education promotes among people obsession with the need to stay in the game. That is the basic sole purpose of education. In consumer race, the finishing line is always faster than the fastest. That is most important. And in that race, people keep on moving. Market only needs an army of workers constantly able to adapt and update itself. It doesn't require intellectuals, philosophers, or social workers in that way. Students in perpetual, they are in perpetual incompetence, and that's why they are addicted to upgrade, inadequate, and they find themselves always inadequate and frantic. This affection, lack of confidence, lasting insecurity are appropriate features of a liquid education. So you can see how students are being affected with this kind of rat race for education, which is for basically degrees and their own professional status. What are the other problems on the social sector side of this modern education, which is neoliberal based education? It generates social injustice, aggravates social inequalities, it restricts itself to the dominant class, and it's for profit, not for the public good. That is the god of neoliberal philosophy. Power is handed over to the market, dictatorship of the market is established, convenience education heightens individuality and autonomy. And let me tell you one point very important is that individual learning needs are in fact the industry's needs. It's not the individual needs which we are basically taken for granted. Universities have been dumped down in the present system, and they are not equipped for the work as commercial institutions. Universities abandon public purpose. They are compelled to chase revenues and rankings. They may end neither one or not the other. Market entails speed and appearance, and which negates the very basic purpose of academic or research, that is thoughtfulness. Globalization is something very different. In the modern, it is basically one element or one constituent from modernity to the post-modernity. The question is, university, as it is being caught in the between modernity and post-modernity, the question is, will universities survive in this new world of globalization and post-modernity? Will it be replaced by a new forms of knowledge organization? That is most important, where we will be deliberating during the seminar for today. New institutions have been established. Already, universities are in transition. At least in the West or in the US, there are institutions which are established and labeled as universities. They are not actually traditionally as universities. New subjects, new curricula, new teaching, new methods of technologies, new conceptions of science and knowledge have emerged. They are crept into and through the university, and this is really very dangerous. Fundamental shift in organizational character of university. Although in India we may not see it very stark way, but it is already happening. Universities have become big corporate bureaucracies. So friend, I won't be taking much more time. These are the basic known problems of Indian higher education, which are common to us, and we are all part of the Indian education system. We can see that there is poor infrastructure, poor research, publication facility, large public funding, inflexible academic structure, uneven capacity across disciplines, departments, eroding autonomy of academic institutions, dysfunctional regulatory environment, accreditation system, low coverage or that too also of no consequence, unwieldy affiliating system, and absence of incentives for academic purpose. Based on all this, what we thought that we'll be picking up, there are so many number of issues or problems within a higher education or education in general, but what we have thought that we will be prioritizing 4 or 5 issues, and these are the 5 issues which we have thought and will be deliberating upon. And of course it is not restricted to, maybe there are regional problems, because earlier, day before, I got a call from Professor Prasenjit Vishwas from NIU saying that he would like to talk about Northeast problems of the university. So I said, yes, this is something really very, very significant, that what we think in terms of the whole national problem, maybe that is different. So one can have, but still, these are some of the main prioritized problems or issues which we have taken, and we will be so the duality between quantity and quality. That means there is a great massification of education by which huge number of students, quantitative expansion is there without adequate provision for the quality. Then this is affecting because of the resources, and in India I have found that nothing works very smoothly in a very balanced manner. Either the government, whether it is from the left or the right, things would be established in a very extreme manner. Extreme, that too in the sense of really ridiculous manner. So there won't be a balance. So autonomy and over-regulation is there. privatization of globalization, which I already pointed out that neoliberalism or globalization in the 21st century education, what education has been already there with us for some time now, we can feel that what is going to come. Changing relationship between teachers and taught. This, I suppose, is really very, very important, because the other day I heard in a board of studies meeting, there were twins between teachers and the taught here. And there is a lot to be talked about that also. Now the quality of staffing, whether it is teachers or the non-teaching staff, the quality is declining, and we do not have, as if we are thinking about academic research, we find that there is hardly any secretarial staff, and the teachers, the teaching community has to do all this. With this friend, this is what I have explained in the next 3-4 all individually. I am not going to take much more time. And now, I hand over the dais and the session floor to Professor Deepak Nair to start the session. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Our host, Professor Arun Kumar and JNUTA, Vice Chancellor Professor Sudhir Sukori, Professor Anil Sabgopal, colleagues. I consider it a privilege to be in your midst this morning to contemplate or to reflect upon the future of higher education in India. We have a very distinguished group of people amongst us who are going to speak about it, and I will be what good chairpersons should be, say as little as possible. It is as clear as daylight that there is a quiet crisis in higher education in India that runs deep. It has some obvious manifestations. First, opportunities for higher education are nowhere near the needs of our evolving and developing society. So there is a constraint in terms of access to higher education. At the same time, we have a situation that while we do not have sufficient universities, those that we have are not good enough. This in turn has a manifestation that the average standards of higher education in India are in decline, and for some time. The third manifestation is that while we have a few centers of excellence in universities and in higher education, they are much too few. So that the challenges that confront us in higher education are about expansion, about inclusion, about excellence. Now, Professor Ajay Kumar drew our attention to the risk posed by markets to our system of higher education. I would say that our system of higher education is at risk. It is at risk not only from markets, but also from the government. Because we do have a situation in which higher education is over-regulated to the point of micromanagement, and yet sorely undergoverned, so that the accountability of institutions in higher education to society is not what it should be. Now, that's one dimension. The other dimension, of course, is that just as the government is responsible for creating a system that is over-regulated but under-governed, we have a situation where the state is progressively abdicating its role to markets. Okay? And we are in a situation roughly where healthcare was 20 years ago. and we have seen the advent of healthcare as business, we are beginning to see the advent of education as business. So there is a complexity of challenges that confront us, in which the only dangers do not simply come from markets and globalization. They come as much from a state which is curiously interventionist at one level, with an intrusion of political processes, which is at the same time abdicating its role and responsibilities in higher education. Now, I will say no more. I'm going to invite Professor Soporik, Vice Chancellor of JNU, to speak on this subject.
Professor Deepak Nair, Professor Anil Satropal, Professor Arun Kumar, all the faculty members, invited speakers, representatives from different teachers' associations from within Delhi and outside, and students. I thought my task was merely to give a very brief account and not to talk too much in details on the subject. And my representation here, I feel, is more as a former JNUTA member and its vice president for some time when I was here, and not totally as a vice chancellor. And also, I consider as a teacher the few views which I have as a teacher of the university. I'm very happy that JNUTA has organized this meeting with all the issues which were listed by Ajay, which are very, very important issues. And the kind of speakers you are invited, especially to listen to the views of different associations, the teachers. And I was expecting that we'll also get the views from the government. Looking forward to Ashok Thakurji's presence here and find out what they have to say to our community here. Because I have listened to them. We keep listening to them. So you're saying quite a few times at different occasions, the government policies which are framed are passed on to the government, to the universities. But this is one topic of higher education, especially in India, which is being debated in many different workshops, seminars, by different stakeholders, be it in the universities, sometimes FICCI organizers, sometimes foreign institutions who are coming to this country, they organize seminars. The British Council organizes many seminars. So there are, I think this particular topic is a highly crowded topic today for discussion in different forums. And in fact, I get almost a letter every day that would you like to come and speak on higher education. I have not attended any meeting. Because except one, I think that there are certain, most of the times when I listen to these, we talk, different stakeholders talk at cross purpose to each other. It depends upon what your interest in the education system is. You come out with those kinds of ideas. And there is no place where you can really mix and match and see what really is to be done in higher education system. There are many suggestions which I do. I think many of these seminars end up either as a very critical of the system, and they come out with what is lacking and what should be there. But very rarely we find anybody giving solutions to the problems. We keep raising the issues, but the solutions which are possible to implement and how to, on a time scale which we can achieve these, are rarely coming. Now, and I personally, I'm more a good listener rather than a speaker, and I like to listen and act rather than just keep speaking in whatever little manner which I can do that. Now, the important few points which Professor Deepak Nair raised, I think we should discuss those issues. One is, of course, the expanding youth of this country who want to get access to higher education. There are millions out there who are waiting to get access to higher education. So the government policy was start new. The solution which came out of it, start new IITs, many new universities, new ICERs which came up, NITs came up, the expansion phase in the last plan period which came up in a big way. But I think the thought process in creating these institutions wasn't deep enough to look at what the problems we are going to face in terms of establishing these institutions. So access, expansion and access, and also equity, which we talk about in higher education. These are three domains which to me are policy driven, and they probably, we can suggest what it could be, but mostly these, as Deepak and I was saying, influenced by the government policies, influenced by the political view thought at that particular moment of time, and maybe very spontaneous or abrupt too. Sometimes we look at that. This is to be done. You find a problem and you give a solution which is not a long-lasting solution or the best solution to resolve those problems. To me, in a very small way, I feel the other important aspect of higher education, especially the role of the universities like JNU, which I personally want to concentrate only is in terms of excellence and employability. At least these two domains, which are not directly influenced by globalization of any kind. Of course, globalization is you look at what is happening all around, and also not, to me, directly influenced by governmental policies or any outside influence. Is it possible to maintain excellence in a university system within the ecosystem that exists with us, within the facilities that we have, within the infrastructure that we have? If in a similar, smaller way, whether the excellence can be delivered. Now, I've been going to different universities sometimes. If you trace the history of this education development of the universities, Delhi University, one of the top universities, at one, it's still there, I don't see it one time. Allahabad University, which was there, I once wrote a whole history of modern plant biology, the area from which I come, and when I went back into the history, I found the best research work in 50s and 60s was done in Allahabad University, in Lucknow University, and many other universities. That time JNU didn't exist at all, or in Delhi University, Botany Department, from where I did my PhD. In fact, that was first time when I listened to Professor Anil Sadgopar. I was doing my PhD there, and he had just finished his PhD, come back from Caltech, from James Bonner's lab, where Professor Satish Maheshwari, with whom I was doing my PhD, had also worked with James Bonner. So he called him there, and I listened to his talk at that time. So we thought here is somebody in biology which will create a revolution in this country by his thought processes. But he chose a different field, which is as important as remaining a laboratory scientist. So what I'm saying is that this excellence thing, that these excellence, as Mr. Nair was saying, that the pockets of excellence did exist in this country at one point of time or the other in different university systems, different departments, which were well recognized internationally. The Botany Department of Delhi University till 70s was the top department internationally. Most of the original thinking in different subject areas, the area of plant tissue culture, 5 or 6 major thoughts came from that department, which even today are cited all over the world. After 70, what happened? Similarly, Allahabad University, I can give examples of many different places in different subject matters where we had high excellence, and over a period of time, now we see that whenever you visit some university and you have casual talks with each other, you will say, "Ab wo baat nahi rahi, ab to kharab ho raha hai, atmosphere kharab hai." Even for JNU, maybe people will say that it is not what it used to be in 70s or 80s. So this thought which is coming into our mind, that at some moment of time we're good, and now things are not as good as, it should have been better, but they're not even as good as what they were. I feel that we should do a research on this, what has really happened, and that we are not maintaining those standards of excellence, what we used to have. And this is something which to me is not influenced by policies. It may be influenced by money, maybe we don't have enough money or something, but I think to give out a new original idea or a spike idea, which I think it should be recognized somewhere, doesn't need an outside support. And this has to come from within. So I think there is a lot more that each of the university systems, I'm talking as a teacher, must introspect ourselves that how to maintain excellence and whether it is dependent on outside pressures or something is happening within the system that we are not able to do that. So this is one thing on which I thought I should reflect, that a research of some kind, some activity to think what is really wrong. The university system, I think I will end up by saying that I still firmly believe what Pandit Nehru said, and that is inscribed on JNU motto. A university stands for humanism, for tolerance. Humanism, tolerance, for reason, for adventure of ideas, and for search of truth. It stands for onward search of the human race towards higher objectives. If the university discharge their duties properly, we are well within our action. So all these adjectives which I'm talking about, are we tolerant? Do we have new adventures of ideas coming up from the university systems? In fact, I was sitting a few days back talking to some people and asking questions. Can we list about a dozen new ideas, extremely innovative ideas, which have come from this university in the last 1 decade, which nobody would else have thought of? Are those ideas present? I'm collecting a list of those and see to tell that you can still be creative despite all the problems. We can, as I was saying, the problems have been listed, student-faculty relationships, we are talking about globalizations, the privatizations, these things which we need attention of the academicians like us. But I think the more important that if we, within each university system, we can develop at least few centers of excellence. We'll have created 40 different, I'm talking about central universities. Can we create 40 different centers of excellence which are matched at the global level? And this is the idea which I told even the president, find out which are the best centers in few universities, support them fully, so that I have created 40 to 42 or 50 centers, best center of political science is one university, nanoscience is other, or any other area in 40 different universities. That will be the nucleus from which the excellence will spread all across to other regions. So thank you very much for having me here. I think you have selected a topic on which all of us are concerned about. We should debate on these issues, but let these debates not remain only the debates. We must try to suggest solutions. Many times the issues which come to our mind are basically from our personal experience in a very mini scale. And we want to project that personal experience on a wider network at the national scale. Like student teacher, it may have happened at one scale, but it may not be the major area of concern for us. So smaller things happening at a smaller ecosystem, whether they need to be projected at a very larger canvas and find solutions to it. That is something which we really need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sobori, for setting the stage for the discussion that's going to follow during the day, in particular for drawing our attention to the fact that analysis and diagnosis are necessary but not sufficient. They should be followed with some thought about prescription. If there is a problem, what is our solution? Of course, if we look at the past 25 years and the debate on higher education in India, we find that the shelves are stacked with good ideas about what needs to be done in higher education. What we have been missing is a political will on the outside and an institutional will on the inside, where it is exceptions that have kept the system going, but the rule, the norm, has allowed it to deteriorate. Before we continue further, there is on the program a presentation of the JNUTA newsletter, which I would request Professor Arun Kumar to do. I'd now like to invite Professor Anil Sadgopal to deliver his keynote address.
Deepak Nair, my former Vice Chancellor, Professor Sapori, Vice Chancellor JNU, and my erstwhile colleague from Delhi University, and of course Professor Arun Kumar, who is a comrade in arms in fighting for better education, and all friends in JNU. So after a long gap, I am speaking to the faculty. I come to JNU frequently to speak to the students. I never have a chance to speak to the faculty. I'm speaking here with a major disadvantage. The disadvantage comes from my academic background. Spent my youthful years of life in the best part of my life in learning and researching in molecular biology and biochemistry. There's hardly a preparation for a struggle for better education, except for training in a scientific mindset. And when I entered this field in 1970, at the age of 30, by quitting molecular biology and biochemistry, leaving it behind, I realized steadily how illiterate I was in social sciences, and that illiteracy made me totally unprepared for building the epistemic base for social study. And I continue to suffer from that disadvantage. That is why I keep carrying these books and all this. I keep referring to them. Three preliminary remarks. One, the crisis of higher education cannot be considered appropriately without looking into crisis of school education. The two are inextricably linked. And therefore, the teachers' associations present here, and that's very good that they are present here, would have enriched themselves by inviting school teachers' associations and having a dialogue together, because as I will proceed further, I'll point this out, I'll substantiate, hope to substantiate, that the crisis is common. The same crisis afflicts school education, pre-primary, schools at all stages, from primary to upper primary to secondary to senior secondary, and higher education, technical, professional, at all stages of education. It's a common crisis. And the more we delink the two, the more we create a crisis. My second point is, second preliminary remark. The crisis of education, including higher education, is in fact the crisis of Indian democracy. And crisis of Indian democracy is the crisis of global capitalism. The three have a direct relationship. The more is a crisis of global capitalism, the more will be attack on Indian democracy, the more will be attack on our education system. And therefore, my third preliminary remark, the solutions which all of us are keen to get, and both the Vice Chancellors have drawn attention to it appropriately, that we need solutions, we need prescriptions, but solutions and prescriptions are not going to come from within the framework in which we have lived since our independence. Or for that matter, since the times of Macaulay in 1835. Good, same as continuing, same framework as well. Solutions will come by opting out of this framework and rebuilding, reconstructing a new paradigm. And that is a challenge. I'll share a small story and make it very short. Story about my first formal, non-formally I was engaging with the attack of neoliberalism even earlier, from 1986 onward, when the education policy was enacted by the parliament. But my first formal engagement was when I became Dean of Education, Delhi University. And within a couple of weeks, it was summertime I remember, I get a phone call from someone claiming to be acting on behalf of a visiting Australian delegation, which is here to build up new memorandum of understanding with Indian universities in education, the field of education. And I was told when he felt that I was reluctant to meet, so he said immediately, already 2 universities of Haryana are ready, and they are in fact the delegation was in Haryana at that time. They are already ready to sign the memorandum, but the delegation is very keen to have a collaboration with Delhi University. So I agreed to the appointment. The 3 of them came. I'll make it short. And they said to me, and I had some security for myself, otherwise I might be in some trouble. So I invited the present faculty member at that time, summertime, 6 or 7 of them present. I said, please come and be my witness before I get caught on the wrong foot. And the delegation told me, the 3% delegation, that before coming to my office, Dean's office, they'd taken a round of the Central Institute of Education, the Department of Education building. They found a building with a horrible shape. Toilets were not functioning, potable water was not available, lecture halls had no smartness about them, no information technology, and so on and so forth. They kept on discussing, which we all knew. I said, we have a solution for it. And as expected, solution was not about education. Solution was about money. If you accept our proposal, with which we have come here, to accept our proposal, sign on the dotted line, which will mean that you will henceforth not give the degree of B.Ed or M.Ed or M.Phil or Ph.D. in education which you continue to give now, or Bachelor of Elementary Education was another program, unique in the country at that time, the first one and probably the one of the best elementary education program in the world. They said none of it will be there. You will give the degree of the Western Australian University. If you agree to this, there will be plenty of money for improving your infrastructure. not just infrastructure, you'll have plenty of money for increasing your faculty salary by a factor of 2 or 3. By this time, small slips of paper were coming to me from my colleagues that say yes, don't argue. The salaries are going to increase by 2 or 3 fold. Then we will tell you what to teach, what not to teach. The curriculum will be designed in Western Australian University. University does provide the facilities here. And fees will go up, of course, only then your money will come. And a part of the new income will go to Australia. They explained all the things. And I said, this is not acceptable. You're not interested, and I won't pursue this matter. As far as infrastructure problem is concerned, we already persuaded University Grants Commission to hike up the annual grants for capital investment, infrastructure investment in my department. Within a matter of 3 years, all infrastructure problems will be taken care of. We do not require anyone from outside. Secondly, as far as the curriculum from Western Australian University is concerned, I have a small question to you. Would you be teaching in the education curriculum anything about the philosophy of education as propounded by Gandhi? So they were perplexed at my question. So one of them said, you are talking of Mr. Gandhi? I said, yes, but he was a politician. What does he have to do with education? I said, thank you, I got my answer. Now what about Tagore's philosophy? I said, Tagore, the Nobel laureate in poetry? I said, yes. He was a poet, what does he have to do with education? I said, thank you, I got my answer. And that is why we are not interested in a collaboration. Then I said, but because they are already pointing out, that means you are not interested in international relationship, you want to live in isolation, alienation, and so on. I said, no, we are very much interested in international exchange, but from a platform of equality, exchange of knowledge. So for example, we are very much interested in knowing how did you solve, or if you have solved at all, the problem of educating the Maoris. I said, what about, how do you know about Maoris? I said, because part of our course here in B.Ed, we teach about the tribal Maoris of Australia, how they are totally deprived of education, they are totally marginalized, and we talk about them because our tribal populations are also equally marginalized. And we already have an international perspective. So like to exchange and learn from you. And in return, we'll tell you what did Mr. Gandhi have to do, say about education, what did Mr. Tagore have to say about it. If you're ready for an equitable exchange, no money is to be exchanged, we'll make arrangement from our University Grants Commission to bring your faculty members here and scholars, and reverse you can make arrangement for our people to go here. No money has to be exchanged. Ideas, knowledge will be exchanged. They lost interest. They left and they never came back to us. And thank God, Western Australian University is not providing B.Ed and M.Ed degrees in Delhi University. I think our former Vice Chancellor will be very happy. I will be very quick in making a summary of what we have been fighting against since 1986 policy formulation. That is when the neoliberal capitalist attack started on Indian education, 86 policy. Not much time to discuss, we've written extensively on this. Many booklets in English and Hindi are available outside, you can get it. Briefly, 86 policy was the first official document of the government which clearly stated that education, school education shall not be provided all children through schools. Instead, it will be provided through agencies and infrastructures outside school known as non-formal centers. And that meant for more than half of India's children in 86, if it is applied today by Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which it is being applied, then it means for more than half of India's children today also. So Dasmani was smiling because he is also being party to this insight into 86 policy. It was the first policy document which introduced the idea of autonomy unfortunate use of this word. Autonomy can have very beautiful meanings. But first policy document which you used autonomy for privatization and opened up the whole door of higher education for privatization. The first policy document which started redefining the meaning of democracy in higher education campuses, from which we are suffering. But now your university suffered and the state university suffered much more than you do, far more than you do. From 1991 was a formal declaration of globalization, opening up the doors for global capital in an unregulated, unabated manner, increasingly of course. And along with globalization came a series of policy documents, internationally prepared as well as prepared within the country, which started dictating terms. How to run your schools, how to run your colleges, how to run your universities. Without any reference to Constitution of India or any reference to Parliament. In fact, from 91 onward, I have listed more than a dozen policy decisions which have been taken outside the Parliament. So that begins the whole process of marginalizing Indian Parliament and of course India's Constitution. I am making brief, I am not going to detail it. The Education for All World Conference held in Thailand in a place called Jomtien, known as Jomtien Conference in 1991, issued a world declaration on school education signed by 149 countries including India, that said that underdeveloped countries do not have resources to provide primary education. That was concerned only about primary, nothing more than primary. Primary education, therefore they require external aid. And remember the follow-up Indian policy documents stated that yes, we'll take external aid for primary. I'm not talking of anything above that. But World Bank is never interested in anything more than primary education, and then is interested in privatizing higher education. So primary education was what they were talking about, 5 years, and in some states of India about 8 or 9, only 4 years. In some other state only 3 years. Entire decade of 90s was focused on primary education of 5, 4 or 3 years. And therefore external aid is to be taken because we were told we don't have enough money. And our World Declaration, prepared under the aegis of World Bank and 3 UN agencies, UNICEF, UNDP and UNESCO, jointly. And it is from then onward I started realizing increasingly, with more and more facts coming, that UN agencies are only providing a human face for the exploitation and oppression which is inherent in the mandate given to World Bank. This is round one I'm talking about, the 90s, when the focus attack was the schools. It was the first attack that was on teachers who were gathered here. That is when we were told that why do you appoint qualified, fully educated, well-trained teachers on full-fledged salaries? You don't have enough money for them. You appoint underqualified, untrained, underpaid teachers, then you'll be able to save a lot of money. And that's when we started on a policy of para-teachers. Within a matter of next few years, within 90s, more than 5 lakh para-teachers were appointed. And now the number is about 25 lakhs or 30 lakhs. Throughout this period, neither the school teacher organization nor the higher education teacher organization bothered. As my title, my focus will be again and again on teachers and organizations. No one bothered. If at that time school teacher organization had woken up, at that time we had 37 lakh school teachers, the attack on teachers would have been reversed. No one raised their voice. The only thing they were talking about was their salaries, their wages, their transfer policies, some other facilities, bonus of various kinds, basically trapped in economism. Higher education teachers were least bothered. They're not even willing to take cognizance of what was happening to schools. until the attack happened on them in the decade of 2000s. And this is precisely the planning of the global capital. Don't attack everyone together, they'll all get together and rebel. To attack them one by one, steadily, stage by stage, region by region. If you attack northeast today, don't attack east. If you attack east today, don't attack the west. Do it one by one. This central university can be done later. Let's destroy the state universities first, then we'll destroy the central university. This is precisely the sequence in which attacks are taking place. Very soon we were told, why do you require one teacher for every class? So this will mean providing 5 teachers in a primary school, or 8 teachers in upper primary school, or 10 to 15 teachers were subject-wise differentiation in high school and senior high school. Why do you require them? Cannot one teacher teach all the 5 classes? Our people, our state representative agreed to the World Bank, but they said we do not know how to do it. Oh, we'll tell you how to do it. They were ready with all the plans. There's a thing called multi-grade teaching, we were told, MGT, in which our own money, the loan was our money because we had to give back the loan was given, and 500 crores rupees was spent for retraining all our teachers, where every teacher will learn how to teach 5 classes simultaneously in a single classroom, because the next attack was going to be on number of classrooms. And no one was bothered. How will syllabi of 5 classes be taught in a single classroom by one teacher? And next time we were told by 96, 97, why do you require more than 1 or 2 classrooms? This was a precursor of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, but that is precisely the policy of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which is a precursor of Right to Education Act 2009, which says 2 teachers in 2 classrooms are adequate for more than 2/3 of our primary schools, or upper primary schools. Precisely what Right to Education Act 2009 does. Preparations were being made in 1990. This is round 1. At the end of the round 1, by the end of the 90s, we saw a tremendous increase in the number of private schools. And enrollment shifting from government school to private school. Of course, when you're going to destroy the government school system, why will the poorest of our country, why will they be interested in sending the children to a government school? They started shifting. And data stand by this. And this was the basic mandate. People keep asking me, why was World Bank interested in India's school system? They're interested here for opening a new market of private schools. And that's what they succeeded in. From 2000 onwards begins the attack on higher education. By this time, school system had been essentially destroyed. Only some remnant tasks were left over, which were taken care of by Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan and later on, finally by Right to Education Act 2009. The round 2 begins in 2000s, when attacks started getting focused on higher education, beginning with budget cuts in state university, steady budget cuts. People being told in the university system, state university, there were 300 of them. Then look, in this particular head, we don't have enough money. You can manage without this allocation, or 30% cut there. Or maybe your electricity, you can reduce expenditure on electricity by 10%, 15%. Every year this will increase, the cuts will increase. And eventually when the state university realized they cannot manage with so little money, then they said, look, what do we do? And they were told, did we ever stop you from starting self-financing courses? To start as many self-financing courses as you want. By this time, the NDA government had made the first offer of higher education to WTO. How many of you have heard of this? Even the parliament is not aware of this, not formally made aware. Maybe some individual members of parliament were made aware. So higher education, which is a concurrent subject of the states and the center, is offered to WTO without any consultation either in the parliament or in state legislatures. Not even a mention of this. And the formalization of this offer was made quickly by UPA 1 in 2005. And offering higher education, what does it mean? Nobody was actually asking us to do that. Majority of the countries, both poor and rich, refuse to offer there any part of education from pre-primary to higher education to WTO. Majority of them. We are part of the minority which came forward and said, hey, here is our higher education ready for global trading. You can invest on it, and there are various norms and standards by which you offer, and that choices are still open, but it can, in the worst possible scenario, it can mean today for us that if a grant of 1,000 crores of rupees is made to 10 universities for improving their libraries by UGC, the same grant will have to be made to a foreign university. This is known as the equal treatment under WTO. This is the worst scenario, not too far away. Part of the WTO rules and regulations. Once you get into the trap, then you have to follow the rules. You can choose not to be part of the trap, and majority of the countries in the world have chosen not to be part of the trap, but India is not one of them. And if we do not opt out of it before the Doha rounds are concluded, and Doha rounds are not being halted because of our stand on education, they are being halted because of the crisis of agricultural trading. If that Doha round is completed, then this offer of higher education will become irreversible, essentially irreversible, and then you won't have any say. Then you have to take permission, probably from a global agency, to hold a meeting of JNUTA in this hall. And this is probably an appropriate juncture when I want to read out what Henry Giroux wrote, the Critique of Neoliberalism in America, American professor Henry Giroux, in 2004. This is, I'm reading it out from a booklet called Neoliberal Assault on Higher Education of All India Forum for Right to Education. It's available outside. Neoliberalism attempts to eliminate an engaged critique about its most basic principles and social consequences by embracing the market as the arbiter of social destiny. We have to decide whether we want market to be arbiter or not. That decision we have to take. Nobody else is going to take it for us. Not only does neoliberalism bankrupt public funds, hollow out public services, limit the vocabulary and imagery available to recognize anti-democratic forms of power, and produce narrow models of individual agency. It individualizes everything. It also undermines the critical functions of any viable democracy by undercutting the ability of individuals to engage in the continuous translation between public considerations on the one hand and private interest on the other hand, by collapsing, very important, by collapsing the public into the realm of the private. India's constitution does not allow this, I can assure you. You can debate as it wants. Yet it is already happening at a rapid pace in India, with the private universities already dictating terms to the state governments, to Vidhan Sabhas. When the first set of private university bills were passed, first in Chhattisgarh, they got cancelled by some intervention in the Supreme Court, but the process continued. And I remember when Rajasthan got into it, initially in the BJP government and followed up by the Congress government later on. And I read one of the private university acts, and I was told all acts are like this. It was the very last part of the act, written in very fine fonts. There are 3 lines. We read something like this. Say, if for any reason the concerned party means some private party, some corporate body or religious body, which has been given thousands of hectares of land outside Jaipur or Jodhpur, so if that party decides not to continue with higher education, the movable and immovable properties shall continue to rest with that party. Period. They were not there for higher education. They were there for land, for real estate. And all other acts now are increasingly following the Rajasthan pattern on private universities. But mind you, The attack is much more epistemic than we realize. Knowledge based. This is why World Bank started writing 20 years ago that the relationship between the teacher and the taught, teacher and the student, and one of the very important issues we have raised, will not be of the teacher and the taught. It will be the relationship pricing by the World Bank as consumer, broker, producer relationship. The student is a consumer, university or college is a producer of knowledge, and the teacher is a broker. The unfortunate members of JNUT are the brokers. And before this equation was presented, formulation, we were told by the same agency that all governments of the world must agree to the user pays principle. All written, you can read it. User pays principle. Like you pay for electricity. You consume electricity, you pay for it. You use water, you pay for it. You use education, service, it's a service. It's no more an entitlement, it's no more a right under the Constitution. It's a service. The moment you agree to the change of terminology, you agree to a change of conception. It's not just a change of terminology. The moment you say, look, we have no problem, whether you call it education, you call it education service, it's one and the same thing, you lost the battle. You lost the battle. If his education is a service like electricity, like water, like road transport, like railways or like airplanes, it's just merely a service, then you come under the paradigm of user pays principle, you pay the cost. If you pay the cost, it comes under the formulation of consumer, broker, producer relationship. We must go back to Ambani Birla of 2000, written by two great educations of India, Mukesh Ambani and Kumar Ambani. The report is submitted to the Economic Affairs Council of the Prime Minister, not to the HRD Ministry. I have a problem with HRD nomenclature also. In 1985, as I said, 86 policy was the beginning of that act. And in 85, Education Ministry was rechristened as HRD Ministry. Nobody asked any question. Everybody seemed to be happy. When you call human beings as resources, resource for whom? Resource for global capital and global market. Once we agree upon it, then why are we concerned about what constitutes knowledge and what is worth teaching and what is not worth teaching? It's been decided by the market. Nomenclature is very important. And neoliberalism is very imaginative when it comes to using new terms. Like say education for all means actually education for none. When they say multi-grade teaching, they actually mean no teaching. Because you won't send your younger brothers and sisters if you are a student, or your children if you are a faculty member, to any school where one teacher teaches 5 classes in a single classroom. You will not. Still you have no problem with Right to Education Act 2009, which essentially says the same. Because it doesn't concern your children. Thanks to the great success of round 1 of 1990, already all of your children, all of your people's children are in private schools and not in government schools, except maybe Kendriya Vidyalaya. Kendriya Vidyalaya still continue to excel all private schools. It's an epistemic attack. Ambani Birla report said, with so many clear words, it said, the state, the Indian state need not be concerned about higher education. If it wishes, it can continue to provide funding for primary. At secondary and senior secondary, already can continue to withdraw, abdicate. But it need not be concerned about higher education. Higher education is one which can be managed by the market, can be handled. Once we agreed upon Ambani Birla report, then why are you quibbling about that market is deciding what kind of courses to be taught, what will constitute knowledge and what will not constitute knowledge? It has been decided by the state. I have been given a slip called 5 minutes. So I'll quickly shift. Round 3 is where we are. Now, higher education and school education is being sold, it's being auctioned. The Mumbai Mahanagar Palika decided last year by full consent in its general body, all parties present here, under the hegemony of Shiv Sena and BJP, but all parties agreed, not a single dissent, to auction under public-private partnership is 1174 schools built out of public funds. And the process is on now, very quickly. We're waiting for 16 Lok Sabha to be constituted. Process will be expedited irrespective of who rules the center. But the policies are being decided at a much higher level called the global capital. Not by the Mumbai Mahanagar Palika. Learning from Mumbai Mahanagar Palika decision, the South Zone Delhi Municipal Corporation decided to sell its 50 schools. Next we hear the Uttarakhand government has decided to sell its 2,200 schools. If you cannot sell them, close them. Karnataka government is closing down right now 12,000 schools. Andhra Pradesh government which closed down 6,000 schools just after our Right to Education Act is now closing down another 1,165 schools. The process of closure or selling is now being expedited. But only then you open up more and more market for private schools. Now it's being done under the public-private partnership Mahamantra. So, what is round 1? Round 1 was to destroy and distort. Round 2 was discredit the entire system. Round 3 is to sell it. In Hindi I have coined this slogan which I keep using. पहले दौर में कहा बर्बाद करो और बिगाड़ो. दूसरे दौर में बोला बदनाम करो. और तीसरे दौर में कहा बेचो. Some view from history. Due to shorter time, I will say that Phule was probably the first Indian intellectual who in his 1882 submission of memorandum to the British Hunter Commission wrote in both Marathi and English on the importance of higher education. Although he talked much more significantly about school education, but he said any country which ignores higher education cannot be a developed country. Gandhi did not just stop at talking about the importance of higher education. Gandhi attempted to redefine the purpose of higher education. In 1936, he wrote a short response to a question from a professor. You seem to be favoring privatization of higher education and withdrawal of the state. In 1936, the debate started. Gandhi said, no, you're mistaken. I said, let BA and MA education be privatized, not because I favor privatization of higher education, it's because the present BA and MA education, 1936, is not serving any goal of the society. It has already become fruitless and pointless. And therefore, I expect the free Indian state after independence to redefine the very role of higher education. If we accept the kind of Swaraj which I am talking about, it's not a Swaraj which Kejriwal is talking about, totally different. Although he keeps mixing the two. But if you read Gandhi's question to the whole Western civilization, he was talking in a civilizational paradigm. And talking of a transformational civilization paradigm, he said, therefore higher education has also to undergo a major change, the purpose. And we are going to build a new economy, decentralized, instituted in villages, transforming society, fighting against caste system, against superstition, against all what is irrational, and such a society will require help from higher education. Higher education will tell us how to access potable water, how to irrigate our field, how to build a new kind of housing, how to build our school system. After all, higher education gives us knowledge to build schools, not the other way around. And he kept on talking about how higher education is so critical. If the independent Indian state decides to promote this kind of higher education, then I'm all for total state funding. If you do not, why waste people's money on giving just plain BAs and MAs? Could he be have been further wrong? He was right. It's very important to learn from a history. Ambedkar, at the same time almost, gave this scintillating slogan: educate, agitate, organize. Absolutely bright formulation for the downtrodden masses. Today, the same slogan he would have himself reworded after seeing this whole neoliberal capitalist attack on Indian education. And he would have said what we said in one of our newsletters of All India Forum, that it's not enough to say educate, agitate and organize. That we have to continue to say. But we'd also say resist, reclaim, resist what is going wrong, reclaim what we have lost and reconstruct the new higher education system. Resist, reclaim and reconstruct. So solutions have to come by changing the paradigm, by shifting the paradigm. Who else will do this other than the teachers? You people. And JNU, like other central universities, are probably today, fortunately, better placed than many of the state universities. Not all states. Some state universities excel as much as you can. The numbers is small. The role of the teacher cannot be confined only to fighting for better wages. That of course is required. The more you get, the more alienated you will become from your own society. The less concerned you will be about the problems of this country. After 6th pay commission, the number of teachers participating in teacher agitation decreased. And after 7th pay commission, you won't be here, you'll be shifting to the west. Yet, 7th pay commission has become the most important issue in higher education for most of our teacher organizations. But I have no problem with it. You get your 7th pay also if you want. But what is most important is, are you intellectually engaged with the whole issue of transformation of the present paradigm of higher education? Yes, question is of access. We all know the data which is being given to us. There's only 15% here to become 40% in higher education. All that you know it better than me. I'm much more concerned about an issue which is not being raised. No more than 6% of tribal children who enter grade 1 are able to cross class 12. That means 94% of tribal not even eligible for entry into even ITIs. My tongue did not slip. I did not want to say IIT. ITIs and polytechnics. Forget about engineering, medicine, law, IT, information technology, whatever else you have. 8% of tribals are in this category, like 6% of tribals. 9% of Muslims are in this category. 10% of OBCs are in this category. Which means almost 90% of the backward sections of society, and which will mean much more, higher percentage if you talk of women students in each of these sections. More than 90% of the backward sections of society are not even eligible for higher education. And you are talking access. What access? Unless you radically transform the whole system of schooling. And I keep asking this question, Dalit leadership also, political leadership amongst them. I don't get an answer. Because like all of us, is there elite which is concerned about higher education. Rest of them cannot cross even class 5. Or cannot even enter grade 1. And this means they are not only deprived of higher education, my friend, they are also deprived of social justice. That means more than 90% of backward section society have never benefited and shall not benefit from any education, any agenda of reservation. Cannot benefit. Yet none of the parties carrying the flag of Dalits and tribals and Muslims are ever referring to tradition. Right? So access is to be redefined. What is access? And private universities, I'm asking questions, are they going to increase the access? Look at the fee structure, look at the knowledge structure. Look at their own alienation from rest of the country. They don't fit into the Gandhian paradigm, nor an Ambedkar paradigm, nor in Nehruvian paradigm. What do they fit in? They don't fit into the Constitution of India. Kothari Commission, the last education policy document of the social welfare state, in 1966, stated private school is anti-democratic. So private school is beginning of discrimination in the country. It does not mean one is saying there should be no private school. Private school can be there if it is willing to join hands with the Constitution of India and follow the Constitution to ensure entirely free education from grade 1 onwards. If it is not, it is against Constitution because it flouts Article 15(1) which says state shall not discriminate or state shall not allow anybody else to discriminate. Article 14 which says equality before law. Both of these, Article 14 and 15, stand fully violated by Right to Education Act 2009. This is promoted multi-layered school system. Therefore, also allowed later on multi-layered higher education system. Let me make it a quick mention. Centers of excellence, of course, in my own college days in Delhi University, there was a center of excellence, 2 or 3 of them in Delhi University. They continue to exist even today, and more have been opened. But tell me, if your entire base is poor, epistemically poor, how will small islands of excellence make a difference? Should the paradigm not be, let's improve the whole epistemic quality of the entire base, and from that organically will emerge centers of excellence. Which Western capitalism followed this paradigm. They did not set up centers of excellence. They made sure every university will be of high quality. When every university becomes of high quality, already some of them or some department within the same university emerge as excellent departments and excellent universities. You cannot reverse it. So solutions have to demand change of paradigm. Friends, in order to conclude and talk about teachers, just I brought this to show you. Here is a document called Slavery, written by Jyotiba Phule, Gulamgiri, 1870s. It's a document written by an organic intellectual of India, long before Gramsci ever talked about organic intellectual. The first known organic intellectual of India. There must have been others also. In this, in an Aristotelian Socrates style, he discusses the history of caste in India. Is it part of the curriculum in Indian university? Maybe at JNU some of your teachers are teaching. Majority of the Indian universities never heard of this topic. Yet they will be teaching something from France, Germany, America or Britain. You not looked into your own research, your own knowledge base. And today Gulamgiri is being adopted in Columbia University, but not in India. Here are 3 historic addresses of Ambedkar to Constituent Assembly of India. Every time I read it, I get excited. There's a hope for our country. By reading Ambedkar, new hope. And if we are not willing to, Caste in India, written in 1916 by the student of sociology in Columbia University called B.R. Ambedkar, young student, who presented a paper called Caste in India, which talked about how endogamy not only sustains the caste system in India, but also controls women. Probably the first, one of the earliest observations on gender and patriarchy. Later on, the students of patriarchy, scholars in this field, developed the whole idea of Brahminical patriarchy much later, learning from, in 1916, paper of anthropology submitted by a sociology student called B.R. Ambedkar. When are they going to become the very foundation of our knowledge system? Friends, a teacher is one who knows not to be co-opted by the market economy, who knows how to resist, how to reclaim, and how to reconstruct, and passes on this knowledge and this commitment to the students. A teacher who's ready to be co-opted is not a teacher who's going to transform the system. She or he can make much more money than the rest, can go to the international bodies, become advisor to IMF and all kinds of bodies all over, but cannot be a teacher who can excite the students and who can transform the system, at least catalyze transformation. So I want to read Marx towards the end. Very powerful formulation by Marx. In considering such transformations, a distinction must always be made between the materialist transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men must become conscious of their conflict and fight it out. Professor Aizaz Ahmed, the famous political scientist, wrote in 2002, this is accepted from one of his lectures to Delhi University students. He spoke to the students saying, to teachers, the battle over ideology and consciousness. Political scientists speaking to Delhi University teachers. The battle over ideology and consciousness, the battle over all their forms, be they political or aesthetic or religious or philosophic, learning from Marx, is thus the central battle, because it is here, in these domains, not simply at the point of production, that human beings actually fight it out. We of course know that, but they also know it, the forces of capital, they also know it. If they are to remake India in their own image, they must first win the hearts and minds of our children and youth. It is in this battle that we must engage, we the teachers, we must engage, because without democratic teachers, there shall be no democratic India. I dare to add a couple of lines to what Professor Aizaz Ahmed said to you teachers. The role of democratic teachers does not end here, it only begins. We must also engage and help build genuine grassroots movements. Instead, infused with a consciousness of the danger inherent in epistemic assault by the forces of globalization and communalization. And globalization and communalization, as you people know better than me, go hand in hand. In order to redeem India's freedom and reassert national sovereignty in policy formulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Satyagopal, for that passionate address. There are three central propositions that emerge. First, that the crisis in higher education and school education are closely intertwined. Second, that the crises are closely related to the crisis in political democracy in India and the crisis of global capitalism, which through markets and globalization represent a clear and present danger in terms of the commodification of education. And third, that the way forward is to construct a new paradigm, resist, reclaim and reconstruct, as you said, and that the teachers have a central role in this process. But we do need to ask ourselves, who is going to reconstruct this paradigm and how? Because the teaching community is caught in the same law of averages that stratifies our society. So I hope that the conference with a long workshop will address these issues. Let me now invite Professor Arun Kumar to speak.
Thank you, Deepak. It's indeed, a great day for Januta to have this seminar, which we hope will, evolve certain, issues which will then be taken up by the teachers' movement all over the country. So what I'm going to do is quickly, because time is running out, very quickly run through a few slides. So I'm presenting what I'm doing from my recent book, Indian Economy Since Independence, Persisting Colonial Disruption. And what the theme obviously is that colonization disrupted society, and that disruption is continuing, and I'll trace how that continues in the education system itself. And the other is from the book Challenges Facing Indian Universities, which came out in 2004, which Januta's only publication. We had a conference in 2004 on 2nd October, and we discussed the challenges facing higher education then. So we brought out those collected papers then. So it's from there. Now the question is that the perspective is important. Education itself is not the issue, and I think Anil has clearly demonstrated that. But what's the perspective that you bring to education that becomes important? We may have full literacy, but it cannot reproduce an undemocratic perspective. Because that's possible, that our literacy may simply reproduce our undemocratic perspective, or an elitist or a consumerist perspective, and Anil talked about it, or it could reproduce a short-termist perspective of life in society. It may produce alienated individuals, as Gandhi said and as Anil was illustrating. So what's our vision of higher education? That becomes very critical, and that's to be situated in the context of society. So question is, can there be a society without education? Indeed not, because education is the most dynamic aspect of society's existence, given that all problems that society confronts, answers to them largely come out of higher education and education system. This continuing backwardness and various problems continue, and this in a sense reflects the problem of education in society. Because it's the role of education to try and resolve the problems that society faces. India today is segmented and feudal in outlook, and school education is segmented, and now higher education is getting segmented. Higher education was a source of democratization earlier, where the well-off, the poor, and the middle class, they all came together. In the school system, they were all segregated between the better schools and the worse schools and the more expensive, and so on. But even that is now changing with privatization that's taking place. So we have to look at the causes of this in the historical perspective. And I think Anil was trying to do that. And Anil pointed to the historical continuity from Macaulay's policy of 1838, his Minutes of Education 1835. Our policies are still dependent on that thinking, where we separate teaching from research. And I can never forget what my father told me, who was a professor in Allahabad University from 46, that the topmost professors of Allahabad University used to say that we are for teaching, not for research, so why do we need a good library? So why should we spend on a good library? So the division between teaching and research goes deep inside, and it's long-standing, and Macaulay actually engineered that. Today, therefore, learning is by rote. Students copy notes, teachers dictate notes, teachers copy notes on the blackboard, not only in the schools but also in the universities. And that's why Gandhi said education is alienating, and he suggested the Nai Taaleem, and I won't go into it in detail, but Dalit thinkers have been saying that our education remains alienating for the Dalits. They don't see the context in which it is being done. And quite clearly, our education system, following from Macaulay's policies, our educational institutions function like offices, 9 to 5, buildings closed. I was lucky to have studied at Princeton for my physics before I switched to economics, and you find the difference in the way the institutions function. It's not 9 to 5. You have, at Princeton, there are 4 Nobel Prize winners there, and you could see them working at 1:30, 2 o'clock at night, the lights are on, you could have canteen facilities, but here lifts closed down at 5 o'clock, the buildings closed down, canteens closed down, so you cannot continue to work even if you wanted to. The enabling environment is not there. You had the key to the library, you could enter the library 34 hours, you had the key to the photocopying machines, that was back in 72, 74. The system trusted you. You could put 4 cents and photocopy. The system just trusted you completely. So in a sense, the enabling environment, where was phenomenal. But today, educationists in India have become highly bureaucratized. They think of everything in very bureaucratic terms, and that's very disheartening. And this is where I'd like to quote from Hind Swaraj, where Gandhi says, he asks India's westernized elite to acknowledge their distance from the people, those in whose name we speak, we do not know, and they do not know us. So in other words, the gap between the elite and the common people of India, Gandhi was pointing to, and I think that gap has only increased. Now, post-independence, we had two major policy paradigms. One was in 1947, and the other was 1991. The 47 paradigm came from the national movement, where it was understood that the basic problems were a result of social, of societal processes. Colonization did not allow education to expand, created various other problems. So poverty, illiteracy, ill health, etc. were all functions of society. These individuals could not solve on their own, and that's why state was given a large role. In 1991, this was turned on its head. Now the problem was individual. If you are illiterate, you have to solve the problem. If you are poor, you have to solve your problem. If you don't have employment, you have to solve your problem. So in other words, go to the market. So in other words, the policy paradigm shifted in 1947 first, and then again in 1991. And that's why all policies have shifted around these two paradigms. So what was happening between 47 and 91, and then post 1991? So today we equate work of an academic to that of a factory or an office. 40 hours, 8 hours in the department, so many hours of teaching, so many hours of this, that, and the other. Whereas the work of an academic is not like that of a factory worker or an office worker. We measure productivity by the number of hours of work, the output produced, human resource generation, like it is as if like producing a crop or doing mining. And that's why, as Anil said, the idea that human resource is like a mineral, it's like a resource. So you generate minerals, so you can also generate human resources through higher education. It's a philosophical shift that has taken place in our thinking, and that's important. And it's in this context that I'd like to quote, the Higgs, Professor Higgs, who got the Nobel Prize. He said that if I had been in today's system, I would never have been able to join Cambridge or become a professor. Because for the first 15 years, when the university would ask him, what have you published? He would write back saying, I've published nothing. It's only in the 16th year that he came up with a seminal paper, which then ultimately, led to the Higgs boson and the discovery of the Higgs boson recently in the Large Hadron Collider. So in other words, the systems have changed quite dramatically. And that's not just in India, but all over. And there are two critical aspects that we need to focus on: the question of autonomy of academics and the question of accountability of higher education. And these have become formalistic or completely missing. And what I'd like to do is suggest that the two are interlinked, autonomy and accountability. Accountability of higher education is to the long-term interest of society. And I think that's what Anil was talking about. What's the long-term interest of society? And who can deliver that? Not industry, which is working for short-term profits. It can only be delivered by autonomous academics who have the autonomy to challenge, who have the autonomy to challenge the existing notions of what is knowledge, what is the critique of it. Those who do not have the autonomy will not be able to challenge. And that's where autonomy and accountability are linked. My vice chancellor can't come to my room and say, today you have to write a good paper. It doesn't happen like that. The head of the department can't come and say, today you have to give a good lecture. These things happen from internal motivation. But if internal motivation is killed, then these things are not going to happen. So you can have 100 mechanically given lectures, and they will be insipid and they'll kill the interest of the student. But one, good lecture, inspired lecture, will go a much longer way. So in other words, autonomy and accountability are interlinked, and these two have to be viewed in the terms of the long-term interest of society. Now, present education policy making is dominated by bureaucratized academics, and they weaken in education institutions so as to serve those in power. And therefore, they marginalize those with independent views. So in other words, there are three kinds of academics. There are so-called good academics, good defined in terms of best. Where did you do your PhD? Where did you publish your papers? Where did you go for conferences, etc.? And you get high points for that. And the other side, you have the bureaucrat academic who are interested in power. You know, they want to gather power. And in between you have the independent academic. And the independent academic is inconvenient both to the good academic and to the bureaucratized academic. And they get squeezed out. So education is all about dissent and not compliance. But those in power and in the education institutions disagree because they think that dissent is a malaise which has to be eradicated. So that's not the essence of education. So today some of the key problems of higher education in India is that we are happy to be derived intellectuals. We derive our knowledge system from the West and we recycle it. So we are recycling knowledge from the West largely. There's commercialization, and some of the worst elements in the private sector are setting up education institutions for a profit. There's a narrowness of vision in the managers of higher education. There's a narrowing of democratic spaces in institutions of higher education. And there's a lack of commitment in society. So the question is, why is this lack of commitment? And that, I think, is the long-term question of why is there lack of commitment to education when education is the key for any society. And I think the roots of that go to philosophical aspects of knowledge generation. And I have argued in detail in my book that there's a loss of value of ideas in society over long periods. It's not as if it's recent. We don't value ideas. And I'll only give you one instance that in 1989, we were doing the manifesto for the National Front government, so National Front Party. The government had not come. At that time, whenever we discussed with the top leadership what should be done, what should be new, they always asked, has this been tried anywhere? And with what consequence? And if you said this is something new, something original, they would say no. So in other words, we didn't have the courage to try something new in the Indian context. It had to be done somewhere else, and somebody else should have experimented, etc. So there's this loss of value of ideas in society, and that actually, therefore, has created the kind of problems that are there. Now, let me skip, because of time shortage, some of these things and come to the role of higher education. And there are two things that are critical. One is to pass on knowledge to the next generation, and second is generate new knowledge for social advancement. So it's higher education which imparts dynamism, and there are no known limits to higher education, to generating knowledge. But what's happening is in our bureaucratized system is that limits are being placed on that. So we need more people, definitely, but we also need better quality. So it's a combination of quality and quantity rather than one at the expense of the other. And it is here that the challenge of globalization adds to the problem. For instance, we are jumping stages of technology, and that requires new social understanding, and that has to come from higher education, but that's not what's happening in the Indian context. I remember a top professor from Princeton coming here in 1974 for a conference in TIFR, and he said, my mind was blown because I could see a 500-year-old technology coexisting with the current technology, and how can that happen in society? It must create enormous stress in society, and indeed it does create enormous stress in our society. But how do we cope with that challenge? It's both for the scientists and for the social scientists to look at it, how to cope with that. Now, it is in this context that the question of resources is raised. So the question is there a resource shortage? Yes, with individuals, because there's enormous poverty, but not with the system. So the question is, how to raise these resources? So society as a whole has resources because there's a black economy, which is roughly 50% of GDP. So you can get an additional 20% of tax GDP ratio, which amounts today to roughly of the order of 20 lakh crores. What the central government raises is roughly of the order of 10 lakh crores. So you can have 30% tax GDP ratio. Now to raise the education expenditure, you only need 2.5%. That means with the additional 20 lakh crores, you can allocate the 2.5% of tax GDP ratio required for higher education. But we don't have the political will to tackle what we need to tackle. It's here that the question of public versus private is also raised. And I'd like to skip a little here and move on, because the valuation of education is very difficult. There's asymmetry between the institutions and the students, and what we need to look at is how to spend the resources, whether through the public or through the private, which is better. And it's in this context that I'd like to skip to this slide, which is market failure in education. There are a variety of market failures. There are scale economies in education. There is merit want that education is defined as. There are externalities of education. There is asymmetric information. But commercialization is not good for our education system. Because of all these reasons of market failure, private sector cannot deliver higher education at the way it is required, especially for a poor country like India. Now, I'll skip some of these because time has run out and come to the conclusions. So, basically the problem is very widespread, it's fundamental, it's a paradigm shift that is needed. So tinkering alone will not do. But unfortunately, that's what our education bureaucracy does. It tinkers with what is required. Copying originality. We are told in JNU that we should be like Harvard or Cambridge. But copying originality is a contradiction in terms. Originality is originality. You know, JNU can be JNU, Harvard will be Harvard, but you cannot copy. The current global crisis that is taking place in the financial sector has added to the pressures on higher education everywhere, in India as well as abroad. We have to address the demoralization in the academia, where we don't even stand up. As Anil said, we have to stand up. We have not been standing up. We have not been taking stands as a collective. So therefore, the teachers' movements are very, very important. How to generate a new ethos in which teachers begin to take stand. We need autonomy both from state and from money power. A state which intervenes and subverts, and here I'm reminded of the discussion between Hill and Bhatnagar in 1952 when CSIR was set up. Hill was writing to Bhatnagar saying, what are you doing? You will demolish your universities if you do this. All the good people will go to the institutions. Who will then train the next generation? Bhatnagar writes back saying, universities are already destroyed because all vice chancellors are political appointees. The question is, the directors were also political appointees. So therefore, if you destroyed the universities, you also destroyed the directors. But the point is that we need autonomy both from state and money power. And in this context, you know, Birla Ambani report and other things have already been pointed to. There are no shortcut solutions to knowledge generation in higher education. So we require basic rethink of underlying philosophy of education, and we cannot be ahistorical. The roots are historical. So we have to look at it in a total perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kumar, for a somewhat rushed yet important contribution, highlighting why we have discounted learning and stifled creativity in our higher education system. You have argued that it is not new, it goes back in time, and it is sustainable. This too is going to need kind of radical change that Professor was looking at. We've had a rich morning, but we are already 10 minutes past the time that was set for this session. Do you think I could take a few questions, or do you think we should bring it close? No, I think that time and patience are both exhaustible resources, so I should not impose my thoughts on this. Perhaps we should just think of this session as something that sets the stage for challenges that confront higher education. I would only like to stress that what I said at the outset, but there were very few people here at the time, that higher education is at risk not from markets alone, but also from governments. And that while institutions of higher education need autonomy and space, they must also be accountable to society. And we have seen a dilution of both. I think it is important to stress and continue to emphasize that for a country such as India, at our levels of income and our stage of development, the role of the government in developing education continues to be critical. That markets are not substitutes, nor are private providers. That you cannot import if you do not produce, as it were, if I may borrow Neil's word, if you do not produce at home because we need to remember that institutions in higher education, universities, are much like organisms that grow in time, that evolve in time, that cannot be transplanted, let alone be affiliates of foreign universities. And at the end of the day, we have to contextualize education in society. But if we do not address this crisis here and now, and alas, I don't see any evidence on the horizon, we are simply mortgaging our future. I do not want to take any more time. I'd like to bring this session to close in the hope that the sessions that follow will have more time for interaction among those who have come to participate in these discussions. Let me thank everybody on the panel, and let me thank you for finding the time and making the effort to be here.
So this brings us to the end of this inaugural session, and what a session it was. It has given so much food for thought, and like Ajay so succinctly pointed in the beginning, that in a country like India, where so many of our kids, they do not even have access to primary education, higher education is really a privilege and a luxury that we cannot really fritter away very casually. So it's all the more essential for this academic community, as pointed out by Professor Sadgopal, that the government and society together, along with the academic community, really define very carefully what is the role of higher education and the set of core values and purpose that should guide our efforts. Or else we'll be at the risk of being swamped with values and commitments that are detrimental to scholarship and learning, or will be caught up in the rampant materialism of today. I thank Professor Sadgopal for a really electrifying lecture where he talked about how we cannot really dissociate higher learning from school education, a very, very pertinent issue that probably is not discussed enough and hardly anybody talks about. He also talked about that the framework for higher education will come from basically reconstructing a new paradigm and what is the role of teachers in that. So I hope it has inspired all of us to really resist, reclaim, and restructure. We thank you, Professor Sadgopal, for such an illuminating lecture. Our Vice Chancellor, Professor Sapori, is a well-known scientist who understands the challenges and issues of higher education from the perspective of both an academician as well as an administrator. He takes a very, very active interest in all the seminars and lectures that are held in the university, to the extent that he's always one of the first person to reach the venue even before the audience is gathered. And this is what happened today as well, that even before our registration desk was set up, Professor Sapori was here. He's one of us, and therefore, all of us have very high expectations from him, and we demand a lot of things from him. The only exception I think that we make to him is that he does not have to fill the API forms, which are really dreaded forms. And that is not of our doing, but the UGC in its wisdom probably realized that in spite of doing all that he does, all kinds of different hats that he wears, probably he will not fulfill the first part of that form, and he will not gather enough points, and therefore his API form will be probably rejected by the internal quality control assessment cell. So, but jokes aside, Professor Sapori he reads widely, and he's constantly updating his knowledge, and he brings a new kind of, perspective and some new thoughts to every meeting that he goes to. And he has raised some very important points today here, that it is important to not only criticize and discuss the problems, but also think about some solutions so that we are not talking at cross purposes. We thank you, Professor Sapori, for taking time out and being here with us for this very important seminar. I thank Professor Nair for agreeing to chair this inaugural session for us, and he really put everything in perspective after every talk very succinctly. We thank you, sir, for being here with us. And we thank our JNUTA President, Professor Arun Kumar, for having thought of this idea and for having brought this very pertinent issue for this day-long seminar. Hopefully it will recharge us, it will regenerate, and it will allow us to discuss these issues at length and maybe think about it more than what we have been doing probably lately. And Dr. Ritwik has been working very hard in the background, developing the concept note that all of you brought, and he has worked very hard for that. We thank Dr. Ritwik as well. And the audience, you know, in spite of knowing that this was not a college function where Bollywood stars were here to sprinkle their stardust all over us, you made time on a Saturday to come here and be a part of this seminar, which shows that there is a lot of hope still for higher education in India. Thank you very much. Please join us for tea outside, and we'll meet here again at around 20, after about 20 minutes, after 20 minutes. Thank you very much.